Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. This session focuses on sociolinguistic phenomena and an imaginary world. I hope and expect by the end of this session you will be able to understand what does the term sociolinguistic phenomena mean and how does it relate to an imaginary world. Well, my dear students, what I am going to try to make you understand through this session is that how the sociolinguistic process takes place, how does this phenomena take place, and how does it relate to society. And for that purpose, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a world for you that is a completely imaginary world, a world that does not exist in reality. So to start with, I would ask you to think of a society as well as a language that is used in that society, a society and a language that you do not know much about or there is very little to say about because this is something really imaginary. Now, this little world is completely imaginary, and sociolinguists or the linguists who study the social aspects of language, they would agree that it is highly unlikely for this to happen because in real life world, this kind of society does not exist. In this particular society, why this cannot exist in real life is because we are going to have a very static situation, a situation in which change does not occur. This society is clearly defined. It has clear-cut boundaries. What does it mean? It does not link to, other societies on other sides, which means there is no chance of interaction with other societies. There is also no chance of the influence of, other societies and the languages of those societies on this particular imaginary society and language that we are going to talk about. Now, what is the purpose of postulating this boundary? The purpose is to guarantee certain things. The first, that though no members of other communities join and mix with these people. So this imaginary world that we are thinking of, or the society we are thinking of, is completely isolated. No people from other societies join them or mix up with them. Secondly, as far as the members of this imaginary community are concerned, they also never leave their own community. They live within their community. And thus, as they do not move out, they also do not take their language out. So it's a completely isolated situation. What does it imply? Well, it implies everybody in this society has exactly the same language. Everybody knows all the constructions of that language. Everybody uses the same words, with same pronunciation, with same ranges of meanings for every single word and phrase that is used in that language. This means no variation within that language exists. No variety within that language exists. A, B, C, D, E, F to Z, every single person uses the same exactly the same language in terms of pronunciation, vocabulary, meanings, etc. Now, what is the problem with this? The problem with this is that very young members of the society who are just learning to talk, they must necessarily be different from everybody else in the world. People, the young members of this society would be different from young people of other societies. In what sense? Because if I would ask you to think of the language that you use and the language your parents use and the language that your grandparents used and the language that your great-grandparents used, you would say there are differences in all these varieties. But in the case of these young children, they would exactly speak the language of the elder people of this community, and there would be no difference. Now, what comes as a solution to this problem? When you think of child language and when you think of the domain of this as a domain of a branch of psychology, not sociology, well, you can talk about linguistic behavior, why they are speaking like that. But psychology can provide general principles of language acquisition which will not allow us to predict every respect in which the language of children in this society deviates from the language of the adults. Now, because no differences exist in these people, in different generations living in this imaginary world or community, what is the consequence? The consequence is that language change is ruled out. Language change does not take place. Since such change normally involves a difference between the oldest and the youngest members of generations, so that when the former all die, only the forms used by the latter survive. So, this is how language change happens in societies. People who use a particular variety of language, gradually they die. And as all of them die, that particular variety gives way to all the changes that take place with the upcoming generation who take up that language and who use it slightly differently. But in case of this imaginary community, this would not happen. Well, my dear students, also because change seems to affect every language that is so far studied by sociolinguists in this field, this makes the language of this imaginary community very different and very unique. What makes it different? Because change in a totally homogeneous community is not possible. Every change affects every member of the community. What I'm saying is, within this imaginary community or society, if there is a change, for instance, A, there is not a possibility of change. B, if a change occurs, how would that happen? How would it take place? It would occur in the language of all the people, because there is no variation in the contexts and there is no variation, in the language use of different people and of different groups. So this change would occur to all the members absolutely and simultaneously. What does it mean? It means one day nobody has the new form of language. The next day everybody will have it. And if you think of real world, of course it does not happen like that in our real world. Another characteristic of the community we are talking about, this imaginary community, is that circumstances have no influence on what people say, either with respect to its content or its form. So, not only the form of language does not change, but also the contents do not change, which means the situation remains the same. Which also means, if you compare it to our world, for example, in our lives, there are certain situations which are formal, there are other situations which are informal, and which require different kind of language. For example, how do you do? How are you? Or, hey buddy, what's up? Kind of choices, they vary in different situations from very formal to highly informal. But since in this society it does not happen, different kinds of vocabulary, such as, the vocabulary choice of the word receive as compared to the word get, you would not find these differences in this society. Also, in this imaginary society, you would not find the differences of pronunciation. So, for example, the pronunciation of the word, not or nut, how it is pronounced in different situations and by different kinds of speakers, you would not find this variation. Nor are there any discussions and arguments or requests and demands, each requiring not only particular forms but also particular meanings. In everyday life, in our society, when we make requests or demands or arguments, or when we give suggestions, etc., different varieties of language are used, but in this society, this is not existing. Also, there are no differences between the beginnings, middles, and ends of conversations. Otherwise in our society, we start a conversation, for example, in a particular way by greeting, and then we have the discussion points, and then there are de-greetings where we close the conversation. But in this case, because the situation remains the same, so we do not even find that variety. Indeed, if we discount any influence of the social context, it is doubtful if speech is possible at all. Now, this is an important point to think about. When it is so homogeneous in terms of situations, in terms of the people, in terms of boundaries of the geographical boundaries, it is so fixed. Is it possible at all that people would use any language? This becomes a huge question. Spoken messages are generally geared specifically to the needs of the audience. There is always a particular situation, a need arises, and people speak. You do not stand up and start speaking in the air. It does not happen so. But because in this society no situations occur, so you would not find any language, in fact. Finally, we must assume that there is no connection between the culture of the postulated community and the meanings which its language, especially its vocabulary, allows to express feelings and emotions. The language must therefore contain no words such as cricket or priest or any such words that are particular to a particular culture, where a particular game is played, or where a sport is played, or where a particular religious figure practices. So, the cultural aspects would be completely removed. To assume otherwise would be to allow rich and interesting statements about language in relation to society, since culture is only one of the most important characteristics of society. So exactly what kinds of concepts the members of this community would be able to express? Possibly, they would only be able to talk about universal truths. Possibly, they would only be able to talk about the logical truths, such as if P and Q are this, then P stands for this and Q stands for this. Only this kind of conversation can take place. Otherwise, feelings, emotions, values, beliefs, nothing would be a part of the language. Since any other kinds of words are likely to involve some reference to the community or the culture, this would not exist. So, the point on which I would like to conclude the session is that communities keep on changing. Communities keep on connecting to other communities. And language used in a community, or languages for that matter, being used in a community also keep on changing. It is not possible to think of a language existing without all this change that comes through the impact of the community. And this is the significance of sociolinguistics, because ultimately it is the study of the effect of society on language.